Good morning. My name is Lee Billingham, and I am a business and strategic development consultant with IMCA. I joined IMCA in November last year to develop and lead our ProjectGHG, and immediately wanted to understand the landscape in which our members are operating. The recently, at that point, announced IMO strategy was very prominent in general discussions. However, once I started talking to the member companies, it was quite clear that actually the IMO strategy is almost like a mood music, like when you walk into the hotel and there's some music or there's somebody on the piano. It wasn't necessarily the key thing that a lot of the companies were concerned about. Two topics were seen as more important and influential in shaping vessel operating companies' strategies. The first, of course, is regulations, and particularly in the EU, but also internationally. The talk from Marianne earlier is an example of the changes that IMCA is now starting to make in this area, trying to get much more support to members in this fast evolving but complex area. Regulations are important because, of course, they set the rules. They're the rules of the game. But the other big area that came through from the discussions with member companies was the view of clients. And of course, these are the companies that pay the bills, that provide the contracts for the operating companies. So they're key as well. What is it that they would be expecting from the supply chain? And it was very clear that actually this wasn't really well understood, and there was a lot of concern about that whole area as well. So to help understand it, I've initiated a series of structured conversations over the last few months, informal, and the comments are not really attributable. So there will be a white paper on all of this coming out in the future, in the near future. This is a summary of what some of the key messages seem to be from the discussions that I've had so far. It's given us some fascinating insights, I think, and I'm sure you'll take something from this. So, first of all, I'd like to talk about the breakdown of the companies that I've spoken to. We are not talking about a large population here. So I can go into this in a little bit more detail, but this is the breakdown. The large international independent oil and gas companies, some major independent oil and gas companies, and one mid-cap or small independent oil and gas company. And on the renewable side, offshore wind developers, a couple of companies not yet fully, you can probably work out who they are, but from the description, but they're not fully operating yet, but they do have acreage and are looking to develop. Neatly, 7 oil and gas companies, 7 offshore renewable companies. A lot more companies were asked for discussions, and I think that for IMCA itself, there's some lessons in this. Rest assured that the companies that have responded to this are the biggest in the world in either sector. So if you think of any sort of major European oil and gas company, I've spoken to them. Likewise on the renewables, similar thing. However, we know that there are a lot of other companies that we could speak to. So I think for IMCA, we're going to look to see if we can expand our connections into those companies and get them engaged in this discussion as well. I'm a great believer in quality over quantity, though. So I think this is a good set for us to go through. And the first thing we looked at was whether all the companies had decarbonisation plans in place, and this is a snapshot of the status. Starting at the top, interestingly, the company that is considering this is the small oil and gas company. They have not necessarily got as far as actually developing or actually putting plans in place. But you can see that the rest certainly have, so that in simple terms, over 90% said that emission reduction targets are in place or will be soon. So why is that important? Well, they're going to seek to decarbonise their supply chains. which is going to extend to the vessels, of course. But what is the client view on the supply chain impact? I asked them, once we'd established that there were plans in place, did they expect what did they expect the supply chain impact to be? Were they seeking some differences from that supply chain? And you can see here, again, the company that is passive, i.e. not really doing much in this area, was the small oil and gas company, but all the other companies, whether it was the large oil and gas companies or the offshore renewable companies, are either exploring, i.e. they're looking at the changes that they could make in their supply chain, their contracting, their procurement processes. They're preparing, so they know what they want, and they're going through a process now of preparing the documentation, the processes to seek to decarbonise their supply chain, or in some cases they are actually acting. You can probably work out which companies might fall into that category without me sort of going into that. Yeah, so over 90% anticipate impacts on vessel choice where there is one. One thing that has come through quite strongly in these discussions is that some places don't have much choice, and that might be down to geography. It might actually due to be supply and down to supply. And Philip talked about that as well this morning. That constraint on supply might mean that some of these emissions reductions targets, decarbonisation targets, are very difficult to achieve, at least in the short term. The other thing that came out of this is, I'm just going to jump forward one. Okay, sorry. The other thing that came out of this as well is, and perhaps it's no surprise to many of you, is that commercial and cost impact is still king. There was only one company of the suite that I spoke to that had actively made a decision to use a vessel that with lower emissions and that was more expensive than perhaps a traditional fossil fuel-based approach. So and there's an interesting dilemma there, I think, isn't there? The decarbonisation plans are good. How robust are they going to be if the vessel supply isn't there, and actually there is still this cost concern, which we know is going to be a real challenge to deal with. I should also say that the company that decided to use the higher emissions vessel was, ironically, an oil and gas company. So they probably say something about the fact that they've got bigger wallets, I think, and perhaps can soak that up, which is a strange place to be, but there we are. So this led me to ask the clients, when do they think things will change, and do they understand the impacts that will have? And briefly, they said, oh yes, we expect to have emissions built into our processes within 1 to 2 years. 80% said that, and 60% claimed to understand what the impacts would be. I'm sceptical about this, if I'm honest with you. There's more work to do, but it perhaps gives you a flavour of where things currently are. And what would they like to see? Just into the last few seconds, so I'll skip through these and I'm happy to answer any questions later. One of the key themes seemed to be around training, whether it was training for their own staff, training in the sector, around how to reduce emissions, making emissions a bit like safety, I suppose. So this is something that IMCA can certainly look at and use its experience of. Leading on to collaboration, there's genuinely and definitely much more scope for collaboration than we see at the moment, whether that's between clients and supply chain, within the supply chain. Standards are often missing. We know that actually in some places that's holding back progress. So again, this is an area where we can definitely help. And finally, advocacy. It's an evolving area. Ian talked about our seat at the IMO. we're actually looking at other areas where we can advocate for the sector, for you as the members, to influence things and get things where we need them at the right time. So with that, I will wrap up there and hand over to Koen, who will talk to you firsthand about a developer's perspective. Thank you.